The COVID-19 pandemic may be the biggest health crisis of our times, but is it also the biggest economic crisis that the world has faced since the Second World War? Going by the initial signs, it appears that the current health crisis has, or will, in a clean sweep undo all the progress the world has made in the past few decades. Progress, especially in wiping out extreme poverty. The World Bank has already sounded the alarm bells in its June edition of the Global Economic Prospects Report, where it has called the current crisis as the world's first pandemic-induced recession. Recession is a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and other industrial activities are reduced, and it is usually marked with a fall in GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. There have been 14 such global recessions since the 1870s. 5 of them have been triggered by financial crises. This includes the Great Depression of 1930 to 1932. Wars, including the 2 world wars, have led to 3 global recessions, while fluctuations in oil prices have been responsible for 2. Major changes in monetary and fiscal policies also led to recessions on 2 occasions. The global recession of 1917 to 21 was partly driven by the Spanish flu pandemic, but experts majorly attribute this to the aftermath of the First World War. Therefore, as the World Bank says, we are currently facing the first ever global recession induced by a pandemic. And not just a pandemic, but the measures imposed to contain the outbreak. The current global recession is also one of the worst. The World Bank data indicates that 90% economies have been hit by the COVID outbreak, which is even higher than the Great Depression when 85% of the economies were hit. In terms of real and per capita GDP, this is the worst recession since the Second World War. The global economy will shrink by 5.2%, while the per capita GDP is likely to contract by 6.2%. On an average, the GDP of the advanced economies would shrink by as much as 7%, with economies in Europe anticipating over 9% of degrowth. But the biggest worry is the deceleration in countries with emerging markets and developing economies, such as India. One of the biggest challenges of this recession will be managing poverty. There have been a steady decline in the poverty rate in the past 20 years, but the current recession will reverse this trend. The World Bank has said that the crisis is effectively wiping out progress that the world has made since 2017 to fight extreme poverty. Between 2015 and 2018, nearly 100 million people were moved out of extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is calculated as someone who is earning less than $1.9 a day. In 2019, it is estimated that there were over 614 million extremely poor people in the world. But today, even in the best case scenario, the pandemic will push some 71 million people back into extreme poverty. This, if the outbreak remains at levels currently expected with economic activity recovering in the later part of 2020. This number will reach as high as 100 million if the outbreak persists longer than expected, with reintroduction of forced lockdown measures. The highest increase in poverty will be in South Asia, which comprises of India, Pakistan, Nepal and Bangladesh. Here, as many as 42 million new people could be pushed into extreme poverty. Sub-Saharan Africa will also be severely hit if the pandemic persists and could add some 39 million people to extreme poverty. Therefore, the scars left by the COVID-19 will be most visible in the poorest regions of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The poor in these regions normally stay in unsanitary, crowded places and have limited access to healthcare. As the impact of outbreak becomes more pronounced in developing countries, a substantial share of these populations employed in the informal sector will be pushed into further poverty. And what happens to the Sustainable Development Goal target of eradicating poverty by 2030? There is a strong possibility that it may not be met. The World Bank now predicts that the global poverty rate in the post-COVID world will be in the range of 7 to 8% of the total global population. And in certain regions like the Sub-Saharan Africa, it could be as high as 30%. In fact, the long-term damage will be most felt in emerging markets and developing economies due to low investment and innovation, erosion of the human capital, and retreat from global trade and supply chain. For example, in the average emerging market, over a 5-year horizon, a recession combined with the financial crisis could potentially lower the output by as high as 8%.